Here we are again for another episode. I'm David Pinsoff. Who are you?
I'm Dave Pietraszewski,
And this is Evolutionary Psychology, the podcast, actual evolutionary psychology by.
actual evolutionary psychologist.
That's right. Keep listening.
Enjoy. David, today we're talking to somebody in Germany.
That's right. His name is Bret Beheim. He is from the Max Planck Institute in Germany. He is a brilliant thinker and
Oh, I
scientist.
have to interrupt you. It's the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology because there's tons of Max Planck Institutes. And this is
Yes,
the one in Leipzig.
that's the one in Leipzig, and he studies cultural evolution, cultural dynamics. He's literally crunching the numbers, doing the math about what culture is, how it evolves, how it spreads, how it diffuses, which is one of the things we talk about. We talk about cultural distance, how we can actually quantify how different one cultural is from another, and how that affects the way we interact with people, whether we're more likely to help or less likely to help someone from a distant culture. What else did we talk about, Dave?
How genes are smooth and culture is crunchy, which is a really nice evocative image. Brett has an amazing whiteboard during this interview. So if you're not watching on a visual format, go check out our YouTube video for a second. And we even talk about things like, do you wait at a stop sign when nobody's around, or the game of Go? Like lots of fun, wonderful things to talk about with Brett. The 2 hours went by so quick.
Yeah, had an absolute blast talking to Bret. It was a really fun conversation. I think you'll have a fun time listening to it.
Okay, enjoy. All right. Today we have Bret Beheim, who is, it's nighttime in Germany, but because of the latitude in Germany, in Leipzig, it's like, what is it, 9? What time is it there?
It is 6.
6. We'll edit that out. I
Yeah.
didn't look at the clock. Yeah, it's 6 o'clock yeah, but it's almost never actually nighttime that latitude because of the. We're going to cut all of this out because it's like Yukon latitude. Because I remember I moved to Berlin, and during the summer, it's always a little bit light out, and I looked it up, and technically it's nautical twilight, and it's because the latitude is so high that it never gets completely dark, which is kind of great in the summer. Like the days are really long. Do you like that, Brett? Or do you have to like, does it affect your sleeping?
No, not at all. I mean, as you probably know, the shutters tend to be really good here, so
Yeah,
you can kind of get a blackout in your room.
yeah.
Uh,
That's
so
nice.
yeah, I like it quite a bit actually.
It,
For those who are listening and not watching,
yeah.
Bret
We're going to
is
describe a scene for you here.
Bret is sitting in front of a chalkboard
Oh
full of
God.
It's
mathematical
beautiful.
equations
It's
and
awesome.
graphs. It looks like we're talking. It looks like he's working on the Manhattan Project. Bret, what is on that chalkboard?
Oh boy. That is
Well,
from a
okay.
discussion earlier
Well, how much
today.
time do we have? Yeah. So
Yeah,
start from the top
exactly.
left. Okay.
Yeah, hold on. Can I move the camera to, pull it closer? No, we were working on something earlier today and sort of stepping through a particular technique that's used called network-based diffusion analysis. And it has I think, a very nice literature in animal behavior, looking at cultural diffusion processes inside many animal societies. And we're
What,
working on a
so
project right. Yep.
so what is cultural diffusion? What is network diffusion? What are we talking about?
So if you're looking at some kind of a measurable, quantifiable cultural thing,
Like
Give
you
some
know,
concrete examples.
canoe design, right?
yeah, whether the well specifically whether the canoe has a certain motif or
Okay.
it employs like a specific feature like an outrigger.
Hmm.
Um, if an animal is able to open a particular piece of food that's kind of hard to open using a specific technique.
Okay.
I mean, kind of the starting.
Coconuts are really hard to open.
Yeah, yeah.
I spent like two
And
hours once on a beach trying to hit it with rocks, and anyway. Christina can tell you about
yeah,
that.
so there's an art to it, right?
Yeah.
And
Sorry. Yeah.
sometimes there's alternative solutions to the same problem. Um, so one of the starting places for a lot of this work is to imagine that you can discretize this. You can say whether the technique was present or absent, or the technology, the item, the marker, the variant was present or absent in a particular observation. And then the analysis for looking at a diffusion process might concentrate on the timing of different individuals in a population showing that particular technique or incorporating that particular item or motif into their repertoire. And then you put that into like a time series, and you can see it spreading through the population somehow. And so, I mean, this works really well in experimental setups with animals. Like if you intentionally, give them a problem that requires coming up with a very discrete and obvious solution, like, opening a puzzle box in a certain way, then mapping how that spreads among individuals in the population becomes the basis for the analysis. Like, how do we describe that process? Like, what is the speed at which it goes? Can we figure out how specific individuals might be influencing other individuals in the acquisition? And that's where the board
That's where all the
stuff
math comes from.
Yeah.
So
Exactly.
so it's based. So you're referring to it as diffusion because you're drawing an analogy, presumably from the diffusion, say, of putting a bit of creamer in some coffee, and the cream will slowly diffuse and blend with the coffee. If you pump cold air into a room, the cold air and the warm air will gradually, the cold air will diffuse.
If you cough during a pandemic, the pandemic will spread in the
And
room.
Yeah.
what you're interested in is the cultural version of that. So if I start tap dancing, how quickly are people going to imitate me and start tap
Not
dancing
not
as well?
quickly at all, David. Sorry.
Not no, you're insulting me,
It
Dave.
dep-
Yeah,
Actually, I
well,
don't know. It's an
stuff,
empirical question. Brett can record, and we can actually measure this.
yeah,
I'm
stuff can
imagining.
die out too if they're not as popular as they
Sorry,
used to be in
David.
the
Oh,
1920s.
uh,
I'll edit that
so
out. I'm sorry.
are you studying how cultural diffusion can die out as well as spread, and what are the factors that? Okay,
Oh yeah,
so
absolutely. I mean, that's the whole the whole story basically is
yeah.
what's the story for the rise and fall of particular trends
Hmm.
over long periods of time, multi-generational time spans. Do we see interesting changes in people's cultural repertoires or beliefs?
Yep.
But then also things that occur very quickly, as we see the arrival of new technology. I mean, I think all of us are sort of grappling with incorporating things like LLMs into our repertoires right now. Like, what's the right way to sort of, have this in the classroom or have this in the workplace?
Yeah.
This is not a multi-generational process. Like, this is happening right now to everyone simultaneously. Just like, I mean, I remember when cell phones first became a thing. That was amazing. It's like I could, call my parents and I wasn't home, and I didn't have to find like a payphone or something. Smartphones too. That's another one I think that,
Yeah.
is quite culturally significant, and is a great motivating example, how rapidly things have changed since then. Like I remember, if you watch this video of, I think it was the first debut of the iPhone back in like 2006 or something, with
It's
Steve Jobs.
crazy recent.
Exactly, right.
2006, something
And
like that.
you watch this video, and at the time, the like cutting edge was like Blackberries, right? These sort of very large brick-like phones that had keypads on them, like physical buttons. And
It was like a miniature keyboard. I mean, like I don't know who. Yeah, it was
yeah,
like
yeah, they're
a
just getting
laptop
bigger,
that you
right?
left in the dryer, and it was
That's
just
right.
shrunk down. Yeah,
And there was this sort of a push to be like, well, maybe we can make the keyboard like fold open, and then you can
right.
have this like full size keyboard that you're tapping on, or there's like all sorts of complicated sliding gimmicks. And then at like the Mac Developer Conference, Steve Jobs, famously is pulling out this tiny little device. And we're looking at, something now that is just ubiquitous worldwide. Like, so many people engage with this technology, and you can see basically when it first really became visible. I mean, it's incredible. Like you watch this and he's got this little gizmo. Actually, can I show it to you? I have like
Please,
I
Please.
wonder if I have this here. Maybe I don't. You have to edit this out too.
That's okay.
Uh, yeah, I have it somewhere, but
We're
I guess
getting
I
a
don't have
better
it
view of the board.
here. Oh, here it is. Yeah. Okay. So, uh, check this out. I got this in my technology museum here. So there it is.
Oh, wow.
And he's up there holding this
So that's the
device, and
first
he's like, "Yeah."
iPhone. That's the first iPhone.
Technically, it's an iPod, but that was when they were switching the iPods to
Sure.
be looking
Sure.
like iPhones. It's the same form factor, I think.
Okay. Yeah.
Um,
Like a
and
deck of cards.
yeah, right. And it's, compared to modern phones, it's this tiny little thing too.
Yeah.
But he's showing, all these things you can do with it. Like they ordered pizza live on stage for everybody, and he's showing all these different apps, and people are like amazed. It's like, oh, I can open up the music app now, and and play it like an iPod. And he's like, oh, I really should, like, go to a new song. How do I do that? And he flicks his finger on the
Mm,
screen, and it has that sort of inertial
yeah.
scrolling
Hmm.
mechanic
Hmm.
that we use every day. And the audience gasps
Wow.
at watching this. It's really remarkable to see, something that is such a, basic part of our daily lives now,
Yeah.
uh, being shockingly new and amazing to people,
Yeah.
not even 2 decades ago.
Yeah.
So that's a big part, I think, of what I'm interested too. Is, I mean, you have a lot of very slow cultural change processes that you can look at over the course of many generations, but you also have very rapid diffusion type processes. Um, and David, to your point, I think that the reason that we use the phrase diffusion for that, I mean, of course, there's a lot of literature on this, in many different social sciences. Like there's that famous Rogers book, the Diffusion of Innovations.
Hmm.
But I think that the primary reason why the analogy is so firm is because there's a lot of similar models for describing these processes. There's sort of these symmetries in the way that we describe these different physical systems. You got physical stuff like the diffusion of heat in a physical medium of some kind, like a block of iron. And you've got the diffusion of genes in a population, which I think is the immediate place where diffusion modeling comes in to cultural topics. And then you have epidemiological work, right, too, which is looking at the spread of particular contagions. And a lot of the math is very similar, if not exactly the same, which is really neat that you can effectively model so many different processes, phenomena, using these kinds of toy models that capture a particular phenomenon. And so that, I think, is really one of the cool sort of starting places. Does it say what are the sort of symmetries that we can see in different topics or different study systems, and what does that help us maybe understand the topic a little bit more?
Yeah. When I looked at your website, I'm looking right now at what your working papers are, which means like the most recent ones. And there's two. One is called The Development of Risk Attitudes and Their Cultural Transmission. And the second one is called A Model of Coronary Atherosclerosis. I can't say that. Can you?
Yeah,
Arteros.
atherosclerosis.
Yes, thank you. And that to me is like so cool because it's sort of like on your website. It would be the equivalent of like I'm studying, like a galaxy and bicycle tires. Like if you don't take a scientific approach, like what does a galaxy and a bicycle tire have in common? Nothing. And I think one of
Yeah,
the things that's like magical about science is that you can have a tool or a way of looking at a galaxy that's the same way of thinking about a bicycle tire. And I think one of the amazing things for me, and whenever I see you give a talk, um, is that it's this taking this approach that's sort of for me as like a psychologist or like somebody who just sort of naively thinks about like, well, yeah, galaxies and bike tires are different. There are all these tools in the evolutionary behavioral sciences for adopting more stringent models. And maybe we can talk about why that is and maybe a little bit about like the backstory. Because so far we've talked a lot about psychology and individual behavior and methodological individualism, but we haven't really talked about why would you want to model these things precisely. But yeah, I want to make the comment that like it's so obvious and cool. I think there's different kinds of sciences. One is sort of like, I study snakes and this is this snake, this is another snake, and that's cool because snakes are cool. But there's another version of science where you unite something like a bicycle tire and a galaxy. And I think what you're doing is sort of like that. It's sort of a superpower.
Thank you.
Yeah. So can we get a little bit into then why do we want a precise model, and what the heck does evolution have to do with any of this?
Oh, that's a great question. Um, well, as you may have talked about in the past, I don't know. Evolution as a topic, of course, didn't start as like a mathematical field, right? I don't think like Charles Darwin was doing any math, in his various work, at least not very formal math.
Yeah.
Simultaneously, there was work being done, by Gregor Mendel and his successors that was very quantitative, and it was trying to carefully measure inheritance in ways that lend themselves to statistical analysis. But it took a while for those two branches, I think, to intersect. It wasn't until like the early 20th century where you really had a lot of work actually uniting the two. I mean, that's what we refer to as the modern synthesis, right? Was the initial kind of wave of mathematical models that were taking Darwinian ideas and coupling them with what we knew about Mendelian inheritance and showing that they were completely compatible, which I think was actually a source of controversy in the late 1800s, was this view that, Darwinian evolution requires things to be a little smoother than they are with Mendel's, discrete inheritance mechanisms. And so these are incompatible frameworks. And people like Ronald Fisher and Sewell Wright show up and they're like, well, actually, you can make mathematical models that account for the kinds of, distributions of diversity we see using discrete inheritance mechanisms. And I mean, it was so successful that we don't even really consciously think about that now. I think that these at one point were almost like rival paradigms for understanding the origin of life. The modeling in that case did a lot of the heavy lifting, I think. It wasn't necessary. I mean, these were very forceful personalities as well. If you know the history of statistics, Ronald Fisher and Sewell Wright. But I think that what really drove home the value of it was that we had these models we could fall back on and use them as a starting place to think about process. That's, I think, very rhetorically useful, like to sort of say, well, we're not just, claiming that, these are the different forces we see in, the evolutionary process. We're giving you examples of how we think they might work in very controlled, sort of idealized circumstances. And then we're sort of imagining how each one of them relate to each other, how you might turn one on, turn it off. If you turn them all off, you get like, Harvey Weinberg equilibrium, right? And that is a starting place.
What is Harvey Weinberg
Oh
equilibrium?
man,
Oops, sorry.
I don't know if I can give that a good rendition. But
New board.
Yeah, exactly. But the
Just
Wait,
the
I've got
basic
another board.
idea.
Just swipe
Yeah.
the board.
That's So the question here, I think, from what I remember from population genetics, is what happens if you turn off every force that we think of as kind of a directional force in acting on a population of genes?
Right. And
So
can I
there's
just
no
say
selection.
like a force would be like, so this idea of, like, as you said, we have discrete genes sort of underlying traits, and there's just sort of a one-to-one mapping, which we talked about as sort of the phenotypic gambit before, and some assumption about how they combine and sort of how they get inherited. And it can be simplified, but still simplified enough to be sort of accurate, right? Like eye color or any trait, right?
Yeah.
And then the forces are, if you just sort of let the model run, there's ideas about, well, some of the traits are favored more than others by the environment, for example, and that's an example of a force. So to what
Yeah,
extent does the
selection.
environment favor, for
Yeah.
example, like having photosynthesis if you're a plant versus not, and so like you could just model that and say, does photosynthesis sort of diffuse throughout the population over time? So sorry, just to give
Yeah.
that sort of background.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's exactly it. And you could think of migration as a force. If there's like a systematic movement of organisms between, islands is the classic uh, sort of dynamic here. Like if you've got a mainland and you've got islands, there's sort of a regular flow rate that's occurring between each place. Um, Drift is also a force. This is something that is maybe not as talked about in evolutionary models, but some people have suggested that it's quite a powerful force actually for understanding how distributions change over time. If they're genetic distributions or behavioral distributions, cultural traits. Um, and that's in the context of the equilibrium model. It's a powerful force when you have small populations. So individual stochastic events can really shift things around. Um, but if you have a very, very large population, then, law of large numbers tends to move things towards averages. And so if you have stochastic events, they're occurring at such a small rate, they're not really modifying the distribution meaningfully. I mean, an infinitely sized population has no drift, basically. Um, and so that's like all the idealized circumstances. Like you're just going through it and you're like, okay, so imagine a population where there's no environmental favoring of specific variants in the population. There's no drift at all because it's infinitely sized. There's no migration, and there's no mutation either. So there's no spontaneous change of one type into another type. I think that's all of them. I'm not sure. Um, but that's a starting place. We're saying, okay, so we switched off all the different forces that could be acting. So then we would expect the population to be at equilibrium, like it's not going to change over the course of time. Um, but then, I mean, that's sort of a null condition, right? Then the question is, okay, like when we do see a change, can we switch on one force or the other in the modeling? And does it look kind of like what we're seeing in real life, like in terms of the
Mm.
rate at which it's happening? Um, does the process of change kind of look like an R curve when you're graphing it over time, or does it look more like an S curve? Is like a classic differentiation of the two. R curves are more consistent with like mutation, and S curves are I mean, the classic selection signal, I think, is looking at like an S curve, a selective sweep. Um,
So it's
yeah,
basically it's similar to the idea of in the same way like gravity. If you have a model of sort of how gravity works, and then you add something like a coefficient of drag, and then you like measure leaves falling, like that was an example I used in an earlier episode. And so you can have a model of sort of, well, here's how the leaves are actually falling outside my window. What's the model look like when we only have gravity? What's the model look like when there's only coefficient of drag? What does the model do when we combine both? And then how does that compare to actually how the leaves fall? And what that allows you to do is ask the question of, we have these models of this complicated thing, like how something behaves, and we're trying to capture something more sophisticated than just down, right? Like if we want to have a model of like how does a leaf fall enough to like predict it or recreate it or whatever, then you need it better than just like an arrow down, right? Maybe. And that's the same thing with human behavior or traits of an organism, right? Like that's the idea that there's this sort of revolution in part of science, which is treating behavior or a trait. And obviously, there's differences between like, hair color versus like what kind of music I listen to, whether like, or the design of a canoe. But as you said, it's this principle of like galaxies and bike tires. There's a level at which the modeling, at least, can capture the changes over time. And that's the thing that like unifies what you're looking at.
yeah, I think that's exactly it.
Yeah, it's crazy.
So, what is cultural distance?
Uh, Well, yeah. How much time do we have?
Brett lives in Germany. He's going to tell you all
Yeah.
kinds of anecdotes on
Yeah,
culturalism.
exactly. Um,
Yeah, there's
yeah.
two
So
ways to answer that. Yeah.
this is a particular concept that has been interesting to a number of scholars in cultural evolution recently. And so there's been a lot of modeling effort directed at this. The basic idea is that we are trying to come up with some kind of a quantification for kind of our sentiment that, two cultures or two sets of norms are more similar to each other than a third that you're comparing them against.
Hmm.
Um, but
Similar
then
to
what
like
that means,
the plant thing, right? Like just in the same way we
yeah,
can say like two plants now have photosynthesis and the third didn't.
that's right.
It's kind of capturing that, but applying it to now culture, right?
So
That's
to
right.
get
And
just a concrete example, you might intuitively think that America and the UK are closer to each other culturally than America is to China.
yeah, that's exactly the comparison. I used
Okay.
that those three actually
Oh,
in a
interesting.
slide
Okay.
recently. And then there's just, various ways to try to quantify that somehow. There's this particular data set called the World Values Survey, which has been a major focus for attention among sociologists for basically giving us a large number of questions that are asked around the world about a large variety of different topics relating to people's values. And then there's a bunch of algorithms that people use. They calculate distance measures and they say these two places are more similar than these two places, or somebody from this country is more similar to somebody from this other country. I mean, this isn't just cultural evolution. Sort of our contribution in the evolutionary sciences, I think, is to try to connect this a little more formally to other kinds of distance measures in biology. But outside of evolutionary theory, there's also a large number of different distance measures that people have used or calculated. What they mean exactly is kind of also a big issue. Like when you say, I think, intuitively that, two societies or two people might have similar cultural dispositions. Okay, maybe you can quantify that somehow, but then, what does that actually do for us? Like, why would you want to know that? And I mean, I think it can go a lot of different ways at that point. Like, people have used cultural compatibility as like in the popular discourse as a sort of a flashpoint for a lot of controversial opinions. I think you can flip it around and also think about this in terms of complementary skill sets or complementary interactive possibilities. I mean, one of the things we think of as as the basis for a lot of economic exchange is having comparative advantage. And if you have two different, quote unquote, you know, skill sets or norms or something like that, it could be that they actually are quite beneficial when they interact with each other. Um, so, I mean, it's not. I think it's not a very well developed topic. That would be my general assessment of it. Is that there's a lot of interest in trying to come up with quantifications of cultural distance, and I think that you can map those on to lots of interesting predictions about things like how people will behave in cooperative experiments, for example. Um, but
So
yeah,
what would you predict there?
well, I wouldn't predict anything. I mean, I'm not actually publishing on this very much, but there was some work recently on using a measure called cultural FST to predict willingness to cooperate in. I believe they were in vignettes that resembled like some kind of prisoner's dilemma type interaction, where there was the possibility of giving an altruistic resource to somebody else. Um,
And prisoner's
and,
dilemma, just to, because I don't think we mentioned this before, believe it or not, would be it's just the prisoner's dilemma of like both people are caught, they're interrogated by the police, and they're interrogated separately. And if both of them stay quiet, they both are well off, right? But if one of them rats on the other, the one who rats is well off, and the one who's sort of the who doesn't rat but gets ratted on is sort of the sucker's payoff. And so it's sort of a distribution of where it benefits you to cooperate, but there's also a temptation to defect on the other. But if you both defect, you're both screwed. And so it's just mirroring the prisoner's dilemma as that toy example fits for a lot of things where it's sort of like, you know, like parenting off effort where, like, you know, if one parent does everything and you're going off and doing fun things, then your kid's okay. But if you both go off and do fun things, your kid's not taken care of. So there's just lots of things in life that have that structure. Sorry to interrupt, but yeah.
No worries. And the key thing here is the ordering of the payoff. So for me, the best outcome is if I defect and you cooperate. Ha ha ha! I got one over on you.
Right.
Second best outcome is if we both cooperate. The third best outcome is if we both defect. And then the worst outcome for me is if you defect while I cooperate. And so
Right.
and so that is the nature of the game.
The suckers pay off.
Yes, the sucker's payoff is
Mhm.
would be the worst outcome. So anyway, now that we know
Yeah.
the prisoner's dilemma, continue with what you were saying.
Yeah, well, I'm just thinking about this paper. I think that the first author is Hanley, and Sarah Matthew is the second author. And
Well,
they were
Sarah
doing.
on in a little bit. Yeah. We're
Oh,
scheduling
right on.
Sarah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, well, okay, then maybe I shouldn't talk
No, no,
about
no.
her
Go for it.
paper.
We all have
So,
so much to talk about. Every guest we've had, we've been like, well, I didn't get to X, Y, and Z. So yeah,
right.
please. Yeah.
Well, they were doing a study working with the field population that she's worked with for some time now. I think the Turkana. Um, and the Turkana are kind of notable for having quite a bit of violence in lots of cattle raiding taking place. Both within the Turkana and also between Turkana and neighboring ethnic groups. And they were very interested in seeing how people would behave, or at least they would say they would behave in these vignette circumstances where they're asked to provide aid to some hypothetical person that may be part of an in group or maybe part of an out group, as measured by the cultural distance measure. And their basic argument is that this measure itself is highly predictive of people's cooperativeness in these kinds of vignette circumstances where they're being asked to provide a resource with no possibility really of return on that resource. So it's kind of like a prisoner's dilemma. It has that kind of altruistic vibe to it. And they found a really strong effect. The willingness to provide that resource is very well predicted by the cultural distance measure itself that they're assessing on people, and they're using kind of a different battery of questions, asking people about a different set of topics.
So the dependent measure here was not cooperation in a prisoner's dilemma, correct? It was the willingness to altruistically benefit the target without any obvious return benefit. Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah. So it wasn't exactly a prisoner's dilemma where it's simultaneous choice, and then you benefit or not based
Right.
on the other person's decision.
So here the result is if we're more culturally distant, I'm less likely to altruistically help you without any kind of expectation of a return benefit. And so I would expect that result to be highly conditional on on that particular game where I help you just out of the goodness of my heart. There could be other instances where, say, we're trading, and maybe your cultural distance might increase the likelihood that I want to trade with you because you have different stuff and you do different things and you have a comparative advantage in some skills rather than others. Has there been work on that, or is it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So my colleague Ann Pizer, actually, this is one of the things she focuses on the most is
Mhm.
long distance interactions between individuals who aren't part of the same ethnic group. Potentially as a desired outcome, like people consciously pursuing long distance ties because they have exactly as you say the potential for providing unique resources or unique interactive abilities. And I think that it kind of works as a nice complement to the sort of altruism work where it really does depend on the interaction structures. the kinds of games people are playing. In some circumstances, you can see cultural distance. Big cultural distances is like a big barrier for getting people organized. Uh, but in a different circumstance, cultural distance could also indicate a lot of potential for mutually beneficial exchange. Because you have, division of labor, you have comparative advantage, you have all these nice things that that humans tend to figure out how to do pretty well, actually. And that's sort of my interest, is thinking about how the game structures affect our interpretations of things like cultural distance. Um, how in some circumstances it might seem like it's a bad thing, in other circumstances it could potentially be highly advantageous to have a lot of distance, cultural distance between people in the same team.
Right.
So, why do you think that is? So why is it that if you're culturally distant from me, I'm less likely to just help you out of the goodness of my heart? But if you're more culturally distant than me, I might be more interested in trading with you to get some of the stuff you have for the stuff that I have. So, what explains that difference in my behaviors there? What do you think is going on psychologically?
Psychologically, oh man. I couldn't even hazard a guess, actually.
Hmm.
I mean, that's sort of outside my wheelhouse. I would much rather ask that to Dave, given your work in group structuring. Uh, I mean, it certainly seems like it's an important force, right? That's my general understanding from reading this literature, is that humans are really groupy.
Hmm.
It's a major structuring process in our behavior, and understanding, how things like opinions form is heavily influenced by our group affiliations. Um, but yeah, I couldn't go further than that in terms of speculation, to be
Yeah,
honest.
me neither, actually. So, but actually, that answer brings up one other question or one other thing to say, which is like, one thing about our science is everybody's sort of doing a different job, and one of the things that we've talked to a lot of anthropologists on, and I always talk about, like, as an experimental psychologist, I can control the variables that I show to participants, and I can have a really good idea about, like, what's the software inside the mind, that's causing it, so, like, I can really experimentally control, like, what I show people, what they remember, what they respond. I can even measure, like, the timing. But what I can't do is, like, measure real world stuff, right? So I have to sort of, like, recapture real world dynamics in the lab. And it's sort of lame, like, on the computer. And so I always want to talk to anthropologists to sort of keep me honest. And it sounds like, in addition to being in part anthropologist, it's also, it's a similar thing of, psychology is interested in psychology, like the individual, like, wiring in the brain. And so, like, this question of, like, why would we care about helping people altruistically who are closer to us, but trading more distantly? But we can't even ask that question if we don't know that that's actually what's happening, right, out in the real world. So it's sort of like the data that we actually have to, like, collect to know even what question to even ask is part of, like, this team effort, right? And so it sounds like one of the things you're doing is, in the old days, our ability to sort of describe behavior was sort of like just write down some stuff people do. And it wasn't very mathematical and it wasn't very precise. And the problem was you could write down the same behavior in different ways, and it wasn't always clear it was true. It's sort of a replication crisis of just documenting what are the things we even have to explain. And so the way I think about it, and you can tell me if this is correct, is that you and, like, the people you work with are sort of in a wave of science where you are sort of keeping all the rest of us honest by coming up with better ways to quantify and measure real world, like, phenomena, right? And so it's sort of, you're developing a toolkit for the rest of us to use and for us to be more confident in, like, we can be sure that this thing is actually happening. Is that sort of fair?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, the way I think about it is a little different. That I mean, there's just too much to observe. like in a
Mm.
given empirical circumstance. Like there's just an infinite number of details that could be potentially recorded. Um, and one of the values of having theory or sort of formal theory is that it focuses things a bit and says, well, some details might be irrelevant for a particular question, even though they might seem like they might be important. Other details might be really important, and so you should focus in on those. And I think that there's kind of this back and forth, then as a result, like we get theoretical guidance for looking, in the sea of infinite observation possibilities to get data. The data is interesting. It builds on the theory and motivates new theory, and then the theory goes back and sharpens the focus a little bit
I mean,
empirically.
yeah, and a good example might be like, and I don't know what the state of the art is, but when we talked to Chris von Ruden, we talked about like warfare and rates of conflict. And you could have a naive view, which is sort of like, well, warfare is a consequence of like how belligerent people are. And there's just sort of like sometimes people are grumpy and other times not. But then there's also like evidence that it's also what correlates or tracks with conflict is also the harshness, for example, of the circumstances for like having enough stuff. So if you're agrarian climate and like if climate becomes bad and inhospitable to having enough stuff, food, for example, then conflict goes up. And so one model, which was sort of just like based on just sort of random, like, do people talk about conflict, is contrasted with a model that incorporates like resource scarcity, but then you need a model of resource scarcity and a way to quantify that so you can actually test between those two models, right?
Mhm.
I mean, my intuition as a psychologist for what's going on there is again, just to bring it back to the altruism toward culturally distant outgroups being low, but exchange with culturally distant outgroups in some cases being high, is that the selection pressures that gave rise to altruism in the first place usually come from the expectation that the altruism will lead to a long-term mutually beneficial cooperative relationship, right? So if I'm, helping people, providing a large benefit to them at low cost to myself, the odds that that benefit will return to me at some point, maybe they'll reciprocate, maybe someone will see me helping them and view me as a good cooperative partner and be more likely to help me. These kinds of return benefits are likely going to be higher if I deliver them to someone who is culturally similar to me. If I'm in a different culture from someone, if I help that person, it's pretty low likely that they're going to come back and reciprocate at some point. Or because we're so culturally distant, the probability that I'm going to form a mutually beneficial relationship with the person I'm helping is just so low. Just because it's just so hard for us to have a mutually beneficial relationship. If we speak a different language, that's going to be a huge barrier to that. So I think perhaps some part of the mind is estimating the likelihood that this act of helping will result in a long-term mutually beneficial relationship that will make the altruism worth it, that will make the altruism pay off. And so that might be shaping the low willingness to help as a result of cultural distance. But if the cooperation is already established and there already is an exchange relationship, and you can already be confident that giving that person something is going to result in something beneficial coming back to you, well, then all that goes out the window, and you can just ask the question of how valuable is their stuff to me, how valuable is my stuff to them, and so forth. And so that I think might be explaining what's going on. Do you buy that story?
Um, yes and no.
Yep.
I think that the thing I would add to it is uh, that it's often the case that we don't know this kind of thing. Like we don't know how likely we are to see a return on a particular interaction, and that constraint is itself important. Like how people get around that constraint or how they use information around them to try to fill in the gaps that they have. So, I mean, that's I would say probably one of the most interesting things about cultural evolution as a subfield is that one of the main focuses is how do individuals or how do organisms figure out things that they would need to know that do those kinds of calculations. Um, how do they know how variable the environment is? That itself is actually really hard because, if it's a really variable environment, then you might not have many examples around to teach that to you because they're all dead.
Hmm.
Um, and so it's now it becomes like an information problem, right? Given the information that I have available, what kind of cognition would you expect to develop that's trying to basically mine information out of the social and physical milieu to try to figure that stuff out. Like, can I find example? So I think in the example you just described, David, it would be very powerful to have examples that you can look at of interactions that then later led to a payoff that maybe wasn't obvious initially. Um, that would be information that you might imagine an organism would add to their own understanding to basically learn the game they're in, right? As they're playing it. I think that's maybe one way to phrase a lot of these problems is that you don't know the rules, you don't really know what the payoffs are going to be. You might not even have any preferences. Like this is the other thing I think that's really neat about looking at the variation between different subfields is that it's not obvious in some circumstances where the preferences come from, like because they're on top. I mean, like, would you prefer an Android or an Apple? Like, I don't know. Like, I mean, that's not something that you could easily map right into the same kind of preference psychology that you would something else. Um, and so, how the preference itself develops, like getting like an endogenous theory of preferences, as they call it in economics, is also neat because it sort of layers on top, it sort of layers upon layers. Like you might imagine modeling the dynamics of the preference acquisition, or the dynamics of learning about how risky your environment actually is. And then you model the behavior of the organism conditional on their understanding based on what they've learned. And it may very well play out exactly as you described. Like if they're starting to pick up, that I mean, there's this famous quote now I'm thinking of from Paul Samuelson, who's a old school economist from the mid 20th century. And he wrote a very famous series of textbooks on economics. And there was this quote I remember from him that was something like, "I don't care which politicians are in office so long as I get to write the textbooks." Um, and I mean, the basic premise is that, thinking about market interactions is often quite counterintuitive, and you kind of have to learn about market interactions to participate in a market economy. Um, and so we see things like, oh, the possibility for mutually beneficial interactions, but that might not be obvious to somebody without a little bit of cultural exposure to that. Um, and I think that part gets really interesting, like how people come to understand the possibilities in a particular interaction. Like, am I approaching this particular interaction thinking about it like, I might a prisoner's dilemma, or I'm totally showing my cards here. When I was in college, I remember reading Non-Zero by Robert Wright and just being like, oh, this is amazing. Like just the way that you understand a particular interaction having a big impact on potentially the way that you carry yourself or conduct yourself.
Yeah. And just to make it concrete, like one example might be like the level of trust in a culture. So for example, like let's say that there's two people in a culture and they detect some cultural distance from each other and therefore don't cooperate. And maybe objectively they would be better off if they did cooperate. And so, for example, imagine another culture where you have that same distance, but for whatever reason, and we'll just pause that for a second, there's like something like sports. And even though they have the same cultural distance, they both like the same sports team. And that causes them to override the evolved psychology preference they would have had in the other scenario, and they therefore cooperate. And so these are two hypothetical cultures wherein it's the same distance the agents are from each other, but in one case, they cooperate and when they don't. Does one do better? And in some sense, then, is it that the culture that has the sports team, that sort of cultural trait or phenotype sort of would outcompete one where there aren't sports teams because it leads the evolved psychology to produce cooperation. Now that's a made up scenario, but that would be like the kind of thing that this is sort of getting at is how do you take an evolved psychology that's sort of static in the sense of its underlying design, but then you get all these multiple, either through drift or cultural inheritance or whatever, variable possible things that are thrown at the evolved psychology, like do you want to cooperate this person versus do you want to cooperate this person who likes Hertha Berlin soccer club, like you do, right? Those are two different worlds, and you can model those things, and then in some sense it's asking the question of, well, why do certain cultural traits persist, and are some of them persisting because, for example, they affect cooperation? Is that sort of fair?
Yeah, one thing I would add to that, which I think is maybe more troubling about the topic of cultural similarity, is that the calculation that you get depends heavily on the questions that you're using for measuring cultural similarity. I mean, it's not like there's a
Yeah,
fundamental unit that is called the cultural similarity between people from the UK and Americans, or
yeah,
people from Germany and France. I mean, you're talking about a battery of questions that are asked in like a particular survey, and then running calculations on that domain and the
yeah,
way that the questions are structured. Um, is that consistent if you would ask a different set of questions, or if I mean, like, as you're framing it with this particular problem, depending on the domain, you might find a lot more affinity than in another domain.
right.
And it might matter a lot. Like, so people, I mean, basically, if anything can come out of this conversation, I would say that this is not something that has guarantees on the tin, as a topic. Like, it's not something you can readily translate into any kind of policy, or even apply it necessarily in very casual circumstances. Is like obviously this way or that way.
Yeah,
So I mean, it's useful to think about in specific circumstances. How might you organize things like a cooperative or a coordination task given a particular institutional environment, and how might, cultural distance help us understand how that's going to play out. But you add in all these other factors, like, some shared affinity for a sports team, or, the interaction itself is in a totally different context than the way that the quote unquote cultural similarity scores are being assessed. All of that, I think, adds way too many complications, and I don't think there's any obvious applications for it in that kind of way.
yeah. I think like you have to have a dialogue with the psychologist, and just to do an analogy, you can say like, was a whale more similar to a cow or a fish? And like, it's a meaningless question because it means like similarity along which dimension. And if you take like a unidimensional similarity, like, well, maybe for swimming, yeah, like the whale's more similar to the fish, but you're not going to get that same answer if you ask, like, does it produce milk or something like that. I also, just as an aside, that also makes me I get uncomfortable when people talk about like a weird scale for countries, like how weird are they, for the same reason, right? Like the Western educated, industrialized, rich, democratic, there are these sort of measures of sort of that assign each country a single number. And I guess that's better than the alternative where that hasn't existed. But it's like with all of these things, with all these models, like Paul Smaldino says, models are wrong and stupid, but we need more of them. It's just that obviously assigning a single number to a country is dumb, but not assigning any numbers at all is dumb. But of course, we just want more numbers along different dimensions. And if doing one number to one country is a step towards multiple dimensions of numbers, that's the right direction.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I mean, there's, that literature itself, I think, is quite interesting in the specific things that are quite notable about humans themselves. Like I think the basis for the weird scale is actually cultural FST. I think that's Michael Muthakrishna and colleagues. And that calculation specifically comes from a thing called genetic FST, which is actually used to do as you just described. I mean, how similar are two different species from each other, or within a population, how similar are two subgroups. And the basic idea with that calculation is using a variance ratio. So if you have a particular species that's divided up into populations or groups, you're asking how much of the total variation that exists genetically, looking at a number of different sites, how much of that variation is explained by the between group variation. So there's between group variation and there's within group variation. And if your cultural or genetic FST is very high, the implication is that within each group or within each population, they're relatively very low variance compared to the between group differences. Whereas if the variance ratio is quite low, then there's almost no variance explained between groups. Like all the variation really exists within each group. And so this is used as kind of a measure of how differentiated populations are. And you can use this in a genetic context actually as the basis for identifying subspecies if FST is very high. Genetic FST, I should say. And one of the really remarkable things about humans is that we have extraordinarily low genetic FST measures. Like compared to other mammals, it's one of the lowest. And I mean, this is completely
we talked
consistent.
about that in an earlier episode.
Oh, no kidding.
So,
Right?
yeah, just because
well,
of my race work, right? Where it's just like I think this might be outdated, but like the thing of like chimps have like 5 times more genetic diversity, and even though you don't have subspecies, and we're all very similar to each other, consistent with like a pretty recent bottleneck in a population. I mean, the building you're in, they're doing incredible work figuring that out, right? The evolutionary history, yeah.
So building on that, I mean, we have genetic quantifiable numbers, which suggests that that we don't have the same kind of strong structural differentiation globally as a species that we see with other species. But behaviorally, we're extremely variable. And if you use the same calculation on culture, I mean, this is the basis for the weird scale, actually. If you take like World Value Survey data, you do measure really high FSTs, cultural FSTs specifically. That the amount of variance. I mean, you can think about this in a regression context. You guys are psychologists, right? So, if you added in group as a conditioning variable and trying to explain some measure that you're looking at, you usually get a really big effect from adding in group as like a predictive category. Because the averages across groups tend to be quite different. Even if there's a lot of variability within the groups, the averages themselves structure across groups in usually in a very noticeable way. And actually, there is a way, in the context of that specific scenario, there is a way to sort of interpret R squared as FST. Like they're conceptually very similar concepts. So if you have a high R squared from using group as a predicting variable, right? That's kind of like what we mean by saying there's a high FST. If that makes sense.
R squared, for those who don't know, is the amount of variance explained in one variable by another.
And in this case, the variable would be just group identity or something like that. But this is just for one measure. I mean, there's different ways to calculate FST depending on how many variables you're using. One of the really remarkable things that's come out of this literature is just measuring these absolutely massive cultural FST numbers, which is quite a contrast with our genetic story. And I mean, one way I've heard this described is that like genes are smooth and culture is crunchy.
I like that.
It's quite remarkable how behaviorally variable people tend to be. But then the sort of genetic evidence suggests exactly what we see with like cross-cultural adoptions, which is that any individual who's adopted into another culture when they're young enough develop and internalize the norms and language of the place they're raised with no difficulty. Like this is not this is clearly not due to anything besides cultural differentiation in terms of socialization, and that also speaks to the recent genetic bottleneck and our absolute lack of subspecies from sort of the biological or genetic definition. And that's also really neat that we have really stark cultural differences globally, where groups themselves or large cultural groups tend to be very distinct from each other in measurable ways. But then you also have the ability for individuals to acculturate into those groups if they're young enough with, essentially no difficulty. And so those two things together, I think, make a very interesting research program in cultural evolution to sort of understand why that happens or what are the implications of that kind of process.
Yeah, and I think historically, and Brett, you were a student of Pete Richardson, is that right? Or what is your?
Well,
I actually don't know your. Is that or you worked?
yeah,
Yeah,
well,
yeah.
so I started actually at Santa Barbara.
Oh, you did. Oh, I knew this
Yeah,
actually. Now that you
I
say
was,
this out loud, we had
yeah,
this conversation. Yeah, please go through.
I
Yeah,
was
please.
I
Yeah.
was an undergrad at UC Santa Barbara
Okay.
uh, in the early 2000s, and I took a class from Don Simons. Actually, it
Ah,
was at the time it
fantastic.
was Anth 5, the Intro to Physical Anthropology.
Mm,
I mean, I'm from originally from San Diego, so I mean, here I am in Germany, but I think that
yeah,
actually we probably have a lot
yeah,
of shared experiences here.
yeah.
Um,
Surf Leipzig. Yeah,
yeah, exactly.
yeah. You can surf in Munich actually. There's like a little river, and you can watch. Go look up YouTube. Surf Munich. Yeah.
there's a rafting thing that's down by one of the lakes here.
Mm,
They've got like a fake course you can go down and river rafting.
fantastic. Yeah.
But yeah, so I started at UC Santa Barbara, and I took classes from Simons and also John Tooby. So
Mm.
I got to interact with. I remember Deb Lieberman was a grad student at the time, and I think I might have participated in her dissertation survey
Okay,
work.
one of the
Um,
grossest questions, like there's like
yeah,
discussed things about like yeah, we were clearing out the Center for Evolutionary Psychology physically, from the Anthro building, and like we came across some of Deb's old surveys, and there's like stuff on that where I'm like, oh my God, I can't like it's great science, but yeah, it's designed to be disgusting stuff about like
yeah.
sexual things and yeah, and relatives and all. Yeah, it's interesting, but anyway, yeah, lest we
Yeah.
digress. Yes, you.
Yeah, so I remember I was very influenced. I read The Adapted Mind as an undergraduate, and I took both the undergrad courses that John was offering at the time, which was Anth 7 and Anth 107. And I think I might have sat in on the lab group too
Mm.
when I was there. So I got a lot of exposure to ideas in evolutionary psychology. The thing that I was primarily interested in, I was actually a history major at the time and doing a double major with anthro. I mean, the thing that I'd always found myself most interested in, still today, is cultural change and understanding why culture. You see large scale cultural changes over time, and so finding a way to connect evolutionary theory, which I thought was a very compelling research program, with that topic, as some kind of cultural evolution um, subfield, and it turned out that there is in fact a group of researchers who do that. And the thing that really appealed to me the most when I started getting into this literature and why I applied to work with Pete in graduate school was that it was very heavily focused on models. Like the goal isn't necessarily to try to you know make forays into social engineering or to do a lot of applied work with saying, oh, we can use evolution to evolve society or something kind of horrendous like that. It was very humble, and it was like, look, we just want to understand these processes. Can we develop simple models to sort of capture some phenomena that we think might be going on? And I'm glad you mentioned Paul's quote, from his famous paper, models are stupid and we need more of them.
Mm.
Because that's exactly it. I mean, we know, from the beginning that these are just little toy models. Like no population resembles Hardy Weinberg, but it gives us like a little toolbox or playground for thinking about some topic. And when we're looking at an empirical circumstance, that's the focus that I was talking about, right? That's saying, okay, well, what kind of models do I know, might be relevant in this circumstance, and what do they say is important to look at? And so that's how I ended up working with Pete and Davis.
And Pete and Rob Boyd were collaborators already at that time when you were working with Pete.
Oh yeah. I mean, they've been collaborators since the late 70s, I think is when they first started
Yeah.
co-authoring papers together. So I'm not that old.
No, exactly. Yeah. Yeah, we need to have Pete and Rob on. I'm working on that. But can you talk a little bit about, I mean, my take on that, and we talked about the Christina episode, is that sort of the older, I don't know how to say this succinctly, but basically one of the first generation things was figuring out sort of, is cultural evolution and evolutionary psychology, and how do these two things sort of fit together? And I think there were sort of battles where there were concerns that the cultural evolutionists were sort of very simplifying the psychology, and the evolutionary psychologists were like really oversimplifying the world. And I think as like the division of labor has sort of grown up, um, I think the sophistication of what we're putting in the psychology and the evolutionary models is increasing, and maybe to some degree the sophistication of the evolutionary psychology models are sort of getting better too, to the point where I'm not sure. I think they're kind of fully blended, but what was your coming from UCSB and then going to Davis? Did you get a sense of that sort of this within group conflict that maybe has sort of waned
Right.
since? Did
Well,
you? Yeah.
like David and I were just discussing, I did have to learn these things over the course of
Right.
time as a
Right.
student. I mean, it's like I think anybody's experience when they get into science, you sort of have the view from the outside, and then as you participate in it, you're like, oh, like it's way more messy than you might have thought of in the past. Um, I mean, the basic questions in cultural evolution often have to deal with, what kind of cognitive adaptations would be suited to a particular information environment. Um, is that not evolutionary psychology? Like you're thinking about how psychology might evolve. I mean, like just in the basic sense of, this is a topic. I mean, clearly there's a lot of overlap here in terms of personnel and interests. And actually, this is another thing which might be, you can connect it back to our just discussion earlier. I mean, I think that the cultural distance is quite small
Mm,
between these subfields, but you wouldn't necessarily know it if you see people arguing with each other
right.
because it's all relative, right? I mean, this is
Yeah.
relative distance in a particular context, matters quite a bit. And I think that we're just as capable of circling the wagons, when we see science itself being, or just the ability of doing empiricism and trying to understand the world being criticized. So yeah, I mean, I can definitely say, having moved between these circles, that there's different emphases for sure. And yeah, I think you're right. Like as time has progressed, there's been a lot of blending taking place. Uh, I mean, there's still some interesting differences which come up. I mean, there's not just different emphases, but I think that places people work. I think it's actually not a coincidence that weird as a concept comes from Joe Henrich, which I would say is more on the cultural evolution side of the
Mm,
spectrum of evolutionary approaches to humans, and that's more of a critique towards academic psychology as a field. So yeah, I mean, the extent. Actually, I'd be curious to know about your take, Dave, on the sort of the long-term effect of weird. Do you think that's changed psychology itself, or evolutionary psychology in particular? Um,
I mean, I think that I think one, it's had a very good effect in the sense of it's been a moral embarrassment to psychologists who have sort of not considered cultural variation or cross-cultural work pragmatically. Um, I don't, I think the deeper thing, which has sort of always been baked in, I think, to the evolutionary sciences, like, and even as much as Rob Boyd and Pete Richardson disagreed with Lita Cosmides and John Tooby, and I will say, like, as a student of Lita and John's, Pete and Rob have only ever been gracious and kind and wonderful to us. And I think we've all had conversations where I think with them, I've had conversations with them where we've talked about sort of the distances decreasing considerably. But all of the evolutionary behavioral sciences baked into it has been cross-cultural work, right? Where you're like, if we think this is a human universal, this is human nature, right? This is part of the design of the evolved phenotype. It makes predictions about we might see cultural variation in this attribute, but not this other one. So, like, if there's a cheater detection system, then certain parts should be culturally universal, certain parts might vary, right? Depending on different things, right? And it gives you that evolutionary approach, it gives you an invariance to look for, but then that invariance also includes a contingent design. So I think baked into the theory of adaptationism in design mindedness gives you theory to predict cultural variability and uniformity. And because of that, that's been baked into the theory. I think in psychology broadly, and I'm making a very broad generalization, and this is not true for every aspect, but the idea of weird has sort of been treated as like, oh no, we do need to like worry about cross-cultural things. But the deep insight of we need design mindedness or theoretical predictions of variability or invariability, I think that still has not really happened. So, in other words, there's sort of a notion that we should run things in different places. But if you don't have a theory of that, it just sort of becomes this thing of, well, I have this idea that people tend to do this, and I probably should also run it somewhere that feels different culturally. And I think that happens a lot. So I think it's good in that sense, but I think the deeper transition to design mindedness is still happening.
Hmm.
Yeah, I would agree. The the weirdest people in the world, that paper, made a big splash, saying that, we have all of this research on Western educated, industrialized, rich, democratic nations. That's a problem. But I think one of the things that has led to is a kind of performative diversity where, oh, let's just throw in some other samples in some other places, when we don't really need to. We don't have a principled theoretical reason to consider these places. We don't have a principled prediction to make about how we expect culture to either vary or not vary between these places. We're just going to include these places just as a kind of performative thing to show that we're being good scientists. I think that is not very helpful. Although, it's always nice to broaden the data set, but still, you want to have a principled reason to consider the places you're considering, and you want to have actual predictions to make. And without that, this a critique of, we don't, our samples are too weird or too non-weird or whatever, it's sort of missing the point. I think the deeper point is that we need better theories, and we need to understand where cultural variation comes from, where cultural uniformity comes from, and we need to dig deeper into the underlying mechanisms.
Yeah.
Well said.
Uh, I think there's this really interesting debate too about, I mean, maybe we could talk about the jukebox model if you guys remember
Sure.
that.
Oh, there's lots of back and forth on the jukebox model.
Yeah.
To enlighten our
Jukebox,
listeners
yeah.
on what the jukebox model is.
Jukebox model. Well, so the scenario, I remember reading this in the Adapted Mind, Barco, Cosmides, and Tubi, and they were trying to imagine a particular mechanism that might produce geographic variation in behavior, without necessarily involving what we might call cultural transmission. And so they had they were using the metaphor of a jukebox, which
Look it up, kids.
maybe,
Look it up.
yeah,
Look it up.
exactly. It's sort of like a large
iPod.
phone that played music, you know. You could select from a number of
Refrigerator
different options.
size. Yes,
Exactly.
exactly.
Refrigerator size, you know. And so they made the argument, well, imagine that these things are programmed so that they play a specific song or type of music, um, given a particular set of coordinates that they're located at. So if they're in a high latitude environment, they tend to play, I don't know, jazz. If they are near the equator, they play, punk rock.
Can I just say I
And
love this metaphor because it's like jukebox technology combined with like GPS, right? It sort of
yeah,
knows it's
exactly.
like
Well,
it's like if you're in
models are
Korea to play
stupid,
K-pop, but yeah, exactly. I
and
just
we need more of them, right?
exactly.
So
Okay.
yeah.
Sorry, I just
So
love
it's,
the
but I
the
mean, the
GPS enabled
physicality,
jukeboxes. Yeah, exactly.
like they're really going all in on this. They're saying it's
Yeah.
not even like the local ecology. It's
No,
not
that's
even
true.
like,
Yeah, yeah,
it's
sure.
literally
Right.
just the physical coordinates on the globe.
Yeah.
Um, and this was like a verbal argument, right? So they said, okay, so imagine this scenario, and then imagine that you were, looking at the diversity of music that was being produced by all these machines in different parts of the world, and you'd say, oh, look, there's this cluster in the tropics where they're all, playing punk rock. This must be a punk rock place. Like this is the cultural transmission mechanism is sustaining this tradition. Um, and I mean, that's, as acultural as you could get, basically, right? So, I mean, I would describe this, I think, as like a reaction norm type model, right? That you've got some, instead of a cultural norm, you've got a reaction norm. Um, that there's some kind of trigger that's causing a particular set of conditional switches in a cognition to produce a specific behavior. Um, but there's nothing you would describe as kind of like cultural transmission or cultural influence.
Right.
Uh, Right. I mean, even culture itself in that circumstance, like as a
Right.
concept, potentially could be maybe not
Right.
that usable. I
Yeah,
mean,
the term
I
they
kind of
use is evoked culture, I believe.
evoked culture,
Yeah,
exactly.
it's
So
like you
evoked
push the
versus
button and
transmitted.
the culture is evoked, and you don't push
Right.
the button in this place and the culture is not evoked. Right.
Right. So, I mean, I would kind of put this in the same category as the Harvey Weinberg thing, like where I mean, it's neat as an example to think, okay, this is a way that variation could be produced. I mean, empirically though, we see a lot of transmission, like we can measure it, right? And so as a null model, I think it's very compelling to say like you don't necessarily need, you can't just assume, oh, there's cultural variation, therefore it's being transmitted. Um, but then the work becomes, okay, well, how do you detect evidence for transmitted culture? Or, what are the kinds of things that might, lend themselves to sort of a jukebox evoked type scenario? And then what other things, like language, I think is a good example where, I mean, obviously there's transmission taking place. And that kind of distinction is very useful for as a starting place for thinking about cultural traditions, um, or what could potentially be cultural traditions.
So, okay, so we just went into the jukebox metaphor. I believe they brought it up to make this distinction between evoked culture and transmitted culture. And the argument is there is just because we see cultural variation, it doesn't mean that we should assume automatically that it's transmitted. It could be a contingent response to an ecological difference, right? So if there's an ecological difference there and we have adaptations that are sensitive to that ecological difference, say we share when there's a lot of variance in resource shortages and windfalls, and we don't share when there's not a lot of variance in resource shortages and windfalls. That could vary by ecology, and you could have an adaptation that is sensitive to that variable. And if one culture shares and another culture doesn't share so much, you don't necessarily need to assume that that is because of transmitted culture or norms shaping one place and not the other. It could just be an emergent output of the underlying sharing psychology. And so that's the
Yeah.
argument that Tooby and Cosmides make. Incidentally, a lot of people misinterpret Tooby and Cosmides as saying they think all culture is evoked, or that, and this is often caricatured. So that's absolutely not what they think. They brought this up as to make a point that we just don't know. We cannot assume that culture is transmitted or evoked without actually doing the hard work of figuring out what's going on. And so that
Yeah.
example was made for that purpose.
Yeah, and
So
oh, yeah,
what
sorry,
do
go
you
ahead.
think is the broader lesson or takeaway from thinking in these terms?
I mean, generative processes are the name of the game here, right? I mean, you're trying to think of a specific, like literally a generative model. Like, and of
Yeah.
course, it's ridiculous. Humans are not jukeboxes. Um, but it's a starting place for thinking about a specific, mechanism that leads to an outcome, right? And sort of inventorying the different kinds of mechanisms or imagining new ones, or sort of, thinking, okay, well, if this specific mechanism is happening, how would we potentially interpret it or misinterpret it? So one of the things I've been spending a lot of time on recently is thinking about coordination equilibria. So like I'd be curious to know what you both think about this. So like if you take the example of like driving on the left side of the road or the right side of the road, um, it's not like the jukebox model because people aren't just responding I mean, in the jukebox model, it literally doesn't matter what other jukeboxes are doing around you. Like there's no influence
Right.
from one jukebox to another in the original model, right? But in something like, coordination equilibrium, when I pull onto the road, what everybody else has already decided to do has a big impact on the payoffs that I experience, right? Like if I
Sure.
choose to drive on the left side of the road in California, I'm going to have a bad time. Um, and so there's a component of social influence there, right? In the sense that people have made choices, and then those choices are going to impact me, and they're going to impact my choice. And so, okay, I would, as a rational agent, maybe I would say, okay, well, I'm going to drive on the same side of the road as everybody else. So is that culture? That I think is a really interesting question. Like, it's not quite the same thing as learning from somebody. Like you're being taught, oh, you should drive on the left side of the road. You should drive on the right side of the road.
Hmm.
Although of course that does happen, but in many of these equilibria circumstances, it's something that's reinforced by just basically a rational calculation. Like given the circumstance, the best thing for me to do is this. And I mean, it doesn't really matter that that's being produced by everybody else's choices. That's just the circumstance in front of me, right? So in a sense, it is also kind of acultural, right? Because there really isn't any, there isn't any way that like information about the choice is directly moving from person to person. Or maybe it is though. I mean, it's debatable. Like if you think of that,
Right.
it's definitely there's more social influence than the jukebox model, right?
Right. I mean, maybe a better analogy would be something like prices. So, if you think in, Hayekian terms, prices are an emergent product of everyone acting self-interestedly in a marketplace. So if I make the price too low, then I'm going to run out of my stuff. If I set the price too high, no one's going to buy my stuff. If you have a bunch of different actors in a marketplace trying to make those local decisions about how to set the right price for the particular goods or services they're selling, you get something like a map of the value of different things or of the supply and demand of different goods and services in the local economy. And nobody actually sat down and planned out what the prices were going to be. There's no central authority that said the price of bread is going to be this, the price of chairs is going to be this. It's just an emergent product of everyone acting self-interestedly in a marketplace, right? And so you could then pose the question: are prices cultural? Nobody sat
Yeah,
down in a centralized place and decided what the prices were going to be. And yet, there's this strong correlation between prices and supply and demand levels. And so, how can we explain prices? And it's you could think of driving on one side of the road or the other side of the road in similar terms. Um, you know, Maybe in some cases we all sat down and decided we're going to drive on the left side or the right side, but in some cases it just kind of happens spontaneously. Like everyone's trying to, drive and not crash, and as a result of everyone pursuing their self-interest and trying to not crash, this emergent outcome naturally emerged. Um,
that's
so,
right.
uh, yeah. So, do you view that kind of thing as quote unquote culture? Do you view it as something else? How should we understand those kinds of emergent products?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's definitely social influence. I think that's
Yeah.
one of the neat things is that what you're basically describing is agents who are essentially incapable of what we would describe as like social interaction. Like they just literally see a price in front of. I think the classic economic description is imagining like an auctioneer, right? Is
Mhm.
sort of telling what the going price is for something, and that's a simplification for what the market is a single auctioneer who's listing off prices, and the agent is responding to that. They're just getting a number, right? It's not like they are in a social context and they're looking around at other people. So the agent itself isn't internalizing anything. It's not taking in what we might call like cultural information or cultural norms, and passing those along, but they are being influenced by others, and then their choice is adding to the influence of the next individual in the decision making process, right? So there is clearly some kind of a transmission of influence.
Mhm.
But I mean, if we really go to the opposite extreme here and think about like something that clearly is cultural, that has sort of a similar shape to it, it might be something like, I don't know, standing at a red light, at midnight when nobody's
Very German,
around.
very German. I see.
Very German, exactly. And as I go home here, right? So I mean,
Yeah.
people will be standing there. The street is
Yeah.
completely deserted,
Yeah.
right? But that light is red, and you're not supposed to cross on red. And so people are standing there, and they wait for the green light to go. But this is highly variable across societies, right? I mean, you mentioned, oh, it's stereotypically German to do this. It is not stereotypical for other populations. I mean, they'll be like, what are you,
Yeah.
stupid? Like, why would you wait if nobody's around? You could just go, right? Um, and I mean, the answer is clearly there was a socialization process. Like people learned that, the appropriate thing to do in this circumstance is to do this. Um, Through some process, like their brains have information in them which they've learned over the course of a socialization process that structures their behavior in ways that you can predict, maybe beyond rational calculation. Like if you had a rational agent, they're looking at the street, they're like, oh, I can go. Like,
I might quibble with. I mean,
yeah,
intuitively, like the reason why I would not run a red light at midnight when no one is around is just on the off chance that like there happens to be a cop driving by at that exact moment and I didn't see them coming. Like that could ruin my life. I get a ticket, whatever. That
hmm
would be a terrible thing to happen. And it's a small probability that that'll happen, but I just don't want to take the chance. I might as well wait. It's not a big deal. It's not a big cost on me to wait a few seconds or a few minutes for the light to change. And so I would expect variation in whether people blow red lights to not so much be a product of whether they've quote unquote internalized this quote unquote norm, but just like how many police are there in the environment? Like how effective is policing? How
hmm
scared are people of the local police? Like that would be, I think, the key variable to look at rather than whether someone has quote unquote internalized a quote unquote norm.
hmm
Would you buy that?
well, I guess the way to look for it would be to find circumstances where there isn't really a strong policing presence. Uh, but people are still really adherent to a particular behavior pattern, right? I think that would be kind of the thing. I mean, we're just basically saying, okay, well, the theory might suggest to look for this now, right? Like the
Right. I
specific
would
scenarios,
not
right?
expect that to. So if there are literally no costs, so
Yeah.
if police never pull you over or stop you for breaking this rule, and there are no social costs either, like no one frowns upon you, no one looks down on you or thinks you're a bad person or a reckless driver or whatever. If there are no costs at all, then I would expect people to not follow the norm,
Can I
right?
just say, so like we lived in a very, and we were just visiting, we just went back for a little bit. Brett, I should have, next time we visit, we'll come down and say hi to Leipzig. Uh, so we live in a sleepy part Dahlem in Berlin, and there's like even the pedestrian like stop, like red and green goes. And it would not be uncommon for everybody like getting off the U-Bahn, the subway stop, when it's red to just stop and wait, even if it's dark, and like there's no cops around, nobody like, there's foxes like running around, like it's very quiet. But I still do think it's rational in like the following two senses. Number one, there is sometimes opacity. So sometimes there will be a green light and a red light, and you think it's clear. And I had the distinct experience in Germany of like as an American when I first got there of being like, well, it's red, but clearly there's nothing gonna happen, and I'm gonna be fine. And then like a car would come, and then the second thing was the lights really work in the sense of they're really well engineered to be timed well, so you're not waiting an exorbitant amount of time. So, like in the US, you might be waiting for 7 minutes to cross a road. That never happens in Germany. So, I experienced not worrying about the cops, but just sort of like this is a sensible like coordination device, and it's actually just sort of like easier to like offload my processing to this thing that really works well. And then I've actually it's I think it's David, it's your point that like it's still a rational calculation of costs and benefits. It's just a different set in my experience, like why I would wait. And then like it does get tweaked. I mean, I can nerd out about like why people cross, but like I'd seen Germans like at a particular light like cross the red light, and I'm like, oh, okay, that one, like it's that coordination device doesn't quite work as well as the other ones, and so I would start like running that one, and then there's like a
They're
rule.
breaking the social contract.
Yeah, exactly. And then if there's exactly, and then if there's kids around, you really don't go because that's like a high social cost. And there's like recursive common knowledge that like you don't do that when kids are around, and like people will look at you if you do that. So that's at least my experience. Brett, you're still there, so like you can flesh that out, or if your experience is different. But that was my experience of like a decade in
Mhm.
Germany.
Yeah, I think there's something to be said for rational laziness,
Yeah,
in the
a
sense
good
that like,
summary. Yes,
I
rationalization.
mean, so David, like to your scenario here of running the, I haven't driven a car in like, 8 years, so I'm totally disconnected from the car culture I grew up in. But in the context of running a red light, which you should not do, right? I think you should advise your listeners that,
Oh. I'm so sorry, but I lived
uh,
in Connecticut after moving from California, and Connecticut is wonderful in many ways, but it was so ridiculous because people would run red lights so much that people would run red lights for maybe a second or two, but everybody knew that people were running red lights, so people would wait at green lights for like 5 to 7 seconds. So everybody
wow,
was
yeah,
way worse off.
coordination failure.
Total
Yeah.
coordination failure where like
Yeah.
people were gaining a second or two, but everybody was losing 5 or 7 seconds on the other end. Clear example of coordination failure. Sorry. Yeah. Don't
Yeah,
mind
yeah.
my
Well, I
words.
mean, I think there's actually a totally undeveloped topic of traffic cultures
Oh yeah.
Mm.
since we've gotten on this. I mean, everybody seems to have opinions about like East Coast drivers and West Coast drivers. I don't know where you guys are from, but if you're in
I'm from the
California
East
now,
Coast, but I live in,
yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
I mean, I
Uh,
notice intuitive differences between Midwest drivers and now I live in the West. I live in LA and
mhm.
LA drivers. LA drivers are way bigger assholes than the Midwestern driver. In LA, nobody lets you in if you're trying to change lane. They don't give a shit. In the Midwest, people slow down and let you in. Uh,
Yeah.
uh, I would imagine that has something to do with the level of traffic in LA, where letting someone in is sort of letting them cut in line. And if everyone's waiting in line all the time in cars, then you don't want to
Yeah.
let someone in. But if in the Midwest, if there's less
Yeah.
traffic, it's not a big deal. So I
Does
would,
I
I
don't
does
would.
know.
does LA have
I'm
a
under
lot
the
of traffic,
impression,
David? I wasn't aware.
yeah, I'm
Yeah.
under the impression that it's totally different, like in New York, that
Oh,
the
yeah.
the driving
Connecticut.
dynamics there.
Yeah.
Connecticut is terrible. I mean, David, you lived in New York, but you didn't drive then, right?
I didn't drive though. No.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I Connecticut was way worse than LA. Like I was
Hmm.
almost like in tears compared to LA driving. Like LA drivers are Midwestern compared to Connecticut. I hope we get a lot of angry Connecticut people. Well, that's the point, right? Like, but yeah, like that like kind of megalopolis corridor where it was sort of combining traffic with like the infrastructure doesn't work and people were just sort of free riding all the coordination devices was sort of what it felt like.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
it seems I want to make a perhaps more controversial point, which is it seems like we're hard pressed to find a canonical example of quote unquote culture where like I sit you down on my lap, I bequeath to you the norms and values of my culture and you internalize them. And then you follow those norms just because they're norms, and you know that you're supposed to follow those norms. Like that canonical stereotyped example of culture we're having a hard time finding any clear examples of it. In fact, a lot of the times when we try to impart our culture to people, they just kind of ignore us, they roll their eyes, they do what they want to do anyway, and like it just doesn't work. Like believe me, I've tried to impart culture onto my daughter as hard as I can, and it doesn't work. She doesn't listen. She does what she wants to do anyway. And so, the controversial point I want to make to you is it seems like most culture is actually not this, vertical transmission of I give you the norms and values and you accept them and you internalize them, but it's more Hayekian. It's more like this emergent product of everyone just following their self-interest, doing what is rational for them to do in their particular circumstances, and as a result, we get these emergent outcomes. We get the outcome of people driving on the left side or the right side of the road. We get the outcome of people using this kind of slang or this kind of slang. We get the outcome of people having these different sharing norms or moral rules or aesthetic tastes and preferences. Everyone's just pursuing their local goals, trying to gain status, trying to outcompete other people in their environment. And when everyone's doing that, you get this emergent outcome that results from it. And so it's less this, I am vertically transmitting culture to you and bequeathing to you the culture that was passed on to my ancestors. It's more just, I'm just doing what I want. I'm just pursuing my goals. I'm just trying to make a living, trying to impress people, trying to gain status. And when everyone is doing that, you get culture. And so that would be the point I would make to you. What do you think about that? That most culture is like that.
I mean, I don't know what most means in this context. Like if we do like a list, like
Hmm.
listens to K-pop, plays Monopoly, like that was just where does the list go, right? I mean, I think that what we're probably on the same page about is the idea that behavioral feedbacks set conditions for decision making in ways that create behavioral variation, like persistent behavioral variation between populations can be produced by those kinds of coordination equilibria in different places. Um, I think that the fact that it's transmitted in some way is interesting. Like there's clearly a social influence here, right? That, individuals might attend to. And then the question becomes, I mean, this is where the cultural evolution modeling literature kind of starts, is saying, okay, imagine that you've got a selective environment now where your cognition is evolving in this kind of a, you know, coordination type problem, and it's costly. Like it's costly to pay attention all the time and try to figure out if I would benefit this one time from running the red light or there's a cop around. Like it's costly to try to calculate how much social sanctioning I might get in this particular, because you have to pay attention, right? I mean, it requires attention. Attention is a resource, right? Um, and I think that one of the things you get from studying this in like a informational sense is that norm psychology is actually a nice solution to this. Like the idea that I can internalize a rule and it actually helps everybody coordinate, and I don't have to pay any costs to paying attention now, right? This is basically potentially a model for explaining why you might get the emergence of a norm psychology, which is quite starkly different, I think, from the mechanism you're talking about. Um, I mean, empirically, this is the other thing, is that it really does seem like there's a norm psychology is a big part of our story when we're understanding why people behave the way they do. I mean, I was thinking about this paper by Bailey House and colleagues looking at the way people behave cross-culturally in the economic game experiments, right? Like the dictator game and the ultimatum game. Um, like you have persistent variation between populations, but you also can track in their study, which came out a couple years ago, um, you can track the trajectory of children like moving towards the adult values that are consistently displayed across populations. Um, which, I mean, it seems like that's more consistent with the idea that they're learning what's appropriate or what's inappropriate in a particular circumstance. Um, but I mean, I think more functionally, you could just appeal to the idea that if it's cheaper to learn a particular condition that helps you maintain a coordination equilibrium, and then you don't have to calculate, that you might expect a psychology to develop an adaptation to just learn what the equilibrium is and then internalize that.
And I think, I mean, to just sort of add to both things, um, also wonder if it isn't that it's a little bit of both, in the sense of, one of the arguments, and Brett, you talked about this earlier, is that we're this sort of weird species that really the cultural phenotype is really different and it's independent of our smooth genes, our crunchy cultural differences. Um, that has itself been sort of an enduring part of our evolved psychology, that we have this idea that there will be transmitted information. And then we have this evolved psychology, this norm psychology. And I think the way I think about it is that the norm psychology is itself a complex adaptation that's sort of calculating, is what I'm doing based on this sequential social transmission process? And is it rationally for me to follow it or not? And is what I'm going to do affect how other people act. So I think it's all coordination and rational choice all the way down in this respect, which is that I don't think, to David's point, I don't think there's any social learning that isn't some result of sort of like a cost benefit individual analysis, whether the evolved psychology figuring that cost benefit utility over evolutionary time. Like, when you're a baby, you're not going to trial and error figure out what's costly or not. You're just sort of doing this quote unquote innate, contingency. But then but still, even for something like this red light thing, there's still some grammar of cost benefit analysis, even though there's represented as a norm. So I think like the norms, I do think, there is an evolved norm psychology, but it's suffused with a cost benefit analysis too, because that would be selected for, right? Like to have a really naive norm psychology that is completely blind to cost benefits and is it beneficial for me or not. And I think we all have this experience. And I think this is part of why we have this theoretical disagreement is like the 1984 thing of like, there's a norm. It's really strong and it's fucking stupid. It's like, it's horrible. It's bad. We shouldn't obey it. And I think that's a result of this psychology that's simultaneously like representing what has been the transmitted information. And then also like, what's the landscape, how it benefits me and others. And I think the expression of that is sort of like the moral outrage in like 1984 and so much other sort of like fiction of like, we shouldn't follow this, or like kids at school are like, this is dumb. So I kind of agree with both of you. I don't know if that's helpful, but yeah.
Yeah, there's a study I was thinking of just now, that was done in a daycare, looking at the timing of people coming late to pick up their kids. Do you know this study? It's amazing. I think it was done in Haifa in Israel some time ago, and it was an economics study. It was published in economics, and they were studying the effect of changing the policy in the daycare from please don't come late because we're waiting. Your kids are here and we can't leave. So it's very inconvenient to you're going to pay a price if you come too late. You're going to get fined. I mean, this was my experience. I've got, older kids now, but when they were young, there was definitely like a fine that was experienced if you came too late to pick up your kids.
Is this in the US or Germany?
This was in the U.S. when
Yeah.
I was in Germany. There was never a fine. It was just like, please don't come late.
Yeah.
We have to go home.
Yeah.
But yeah, in the U.S. it was totally commercialized, right? It was like you will get $60 for every half hour, right, or something astronomically high. And so in the Israeli daycare, they made this switch. They moved from like basically just like a pleading with people not to come late to here's what we're going to pay. You're gonna have to pay this much if you come late. And paradoxically, perhaps, it increased the rate of tardiness because now there was a price associated with the lateness. And so people are like, is 30 minutes worth this much to me? And the answer was sometimes yes, right? And so the title of the paper is A Fine is a Price. It's this extremely famous paper in economics. And it's such a wonderful illustration of, at least from my point of view, the differences between looking at it in terms of rational cost benefit analysis and sort of looking at it as this vague, pro-social behavior that we're just asking you to do, like please don't come late because you're inconveniencing somebody else. And I don't know, it almost seems to me like there's two modes of thinking about these. Like as soon as you start adding money involved, it really does just seem like a commercial exchange where it's like, okay, I'm paying you $60 to stay here for 30 more minutes, right?
Yeah, you wouldn't have offered me $60, or you wouldn't have
exactly
told me what your price was if you weren't willing to do
market.
it. Yeah,
this is
exactly.
clearly the market rate here, right? So,
Right. Yeah.
So, but thinking about it that way, I mean, if you think about any fine that way, then it really becomes kind of ghoulish, right? Where it's just like, oh, well, if you have enough money, then it's just like you're paying to break the law, right? It's just like, okay, I will pay this much to not have to do this, right? But is that the way we think about norms? I mean, it feels to me like in normal circumstances, it's not like that. That people do actually behave pro-socially without the explicit threat of fining, because they don't think about it as like an economic exchange with an explicit cost benefit And as soon as you do that, it shifts modes, and then it does actually become much more like a market interaction. And in that circumstance, I think it's very clear that that rational calculation is the right way to think about this, because you have a price schedule, right? You know exactly what it's going to be. Like you can map out, 1 hour of their time is this much money. So anyway,
Yeah.
I just think there's different ways of thinking about institutional structures. Sometimes it emphasizes very explicit costs on the part of the agent, where they have to make these calculations. Like is this the right thing for me to do right now to give me some payoff that I want with some acceptable risk, right? And I'm trying to put all these variables together in this complex calculus. Other times I think it's like, I just do this because that's what we do here. And it's, vaguely creating a coordination equilibrium, and it's solving some kind of, social, collective action problem. But I don't know if people think about it more than that. Like that's just my vague guess here, is that if you actually see how people are thinking about this, they just say, "Well, I do that because that's what people told me to do," which I think is quite the the point of controversy, right? It comes down to
Yeah, that
this,
is.
like,
I would expect that even when people say, I'm just doing it because that's the way we do it around here, is that they're implicitly simulating someone who might judge them for not doing that. And that they're interpreting that as a social cost. Like, I'm going to pay reputational costs for not doing this. People are going to make the following inferences about me if I violate this norm. They're going to think I'm a bad person, I'm lazy, I'm, unreliable, whatever. And I do not want people to think that about me, so that therefore I'm not going to do it. It's not just it's a norm, therefore I follow it. It's, oh, what are people going to think of me? What's going to happen if I don't do this? And they're simulating those outcomes. They're simulating the audience and what people are going to think of them. And I think we're constantly doing this all the time. We have a little audience in our head that is constantly judging us for every little thing we do and plan on doing and anticipate doing. And we're factoring those anticipated costs into everything we do. And so I think just positing that a social psychology, that impression management, for lack of a better term, gets you, explains a lot. It explains a lot of what we intuitively think of as norms. And I think it even explains the example you just mentioned with, um, you know, paying the late fee, right? I think what we're doing is we're running a social calculation where we're saying, oh, if they're charging me money for showing up late, that means that they don't think I'm a bad person. Then if I pay the fine, then I've made amends, and they're cool with it, right? So I might as well pay the fine, and they'll be cool with it. But in the absence of that fine, you might make the inference that they're going to judge you as a bad parent, right? And that's going to hurt your reputation. And so I think that is probably what's going on and explaining these different outcomes, is that we have a sophisticated social psychology that is anticipating the inferences that are made about us for every little thing we do. And that, as a result of that social psychology, as a result of us playing our status games and thinking about how other people are going to judge us and trying to navigate the social world, we get these emergent things that we call norms. Um, anyway, that's my spiel. I think it continues to be an interesting debate in evolutionary psychology and cultural evolution, how we should think about these things, how we should think about norms, how we should think about culture. What is the role of evolved psychology? What is the evolved psychology like? Uh,
Yeah, I
Brett,
think
we
oh,
are running up on what, 2 hours now? Should
almost.
we?
whew,
Yeah, this went quick. This is
Yeah,
wonderful. And I think just
yeah,
to
yeah, it's a lot of fun.
put a
yeah,
pin on that, I think like Brett, I don't think you would disagree with that thing that David said too. I think like part of it is just that the content then of like what are the implicit things that people are worrying about is part of like the norm. So like in the same way, like the you Brett talked about the auction, right? In a more sophisticated version, it's not just that you're willing to go with the price in the auction, but like you're going and you're paying like, I don't know, $10 for the bag of flour. I'm like astounded at the price of groceries in the US compared to Germany. It's like crazy. We're paying like 3 to 10 times more for like every item of food compared to Germany. It's crazy. But anyway,
You have my
so like,
sympathies.
yeah. So, but like, me actually like paying a price for something, David will see that, right? And that becomes part of then his cost benefit analysis, right? So like I think the transmission chain of behaviors, we're psychologically aware of that. And then also David's doing a cost benefit analysis, and I'm sort of aware that David might do a cost benefit analysis of what I'm doing, and that factors into my cost benefit analysis of like, should I do it? And so I think that yeah, I think this just comes back to like from my perspective, I see these views as very compatible. It's just that there's no pure cultural transmission without a cost benefit analysis. It's like just like fractal, where there's always like a inside that, and it might in it, but it's different. It's different than like a purely fungible market economy thing. It's like this uncertainty about social costs, which have a very different dynamic, for example, than like the
Yeah.
market. And so I view these as like, I think you're both right, but maybe that's because I'm
Yeah.
from Buffalo and that's the way people are.
Well, maybe, I mean, that variation, I think, is, I mean, Midwest nice is also it's
Yeah,
a real thing, right?
exactly.
Well, I guess this would be the question that I would think about in this circumstance. I mean, if you really wanted to communicate to your kid, for example, that certain behavior will result in social sanctioning, like presumably that would be really important to impart upon them. I mean, they might not appreciate it, but it's like, look, kid, you
Yeah,
got to believe me. I know that it doesn't seem like it's a big deal to
yeah,
cross the red light,
yeah,
but you will die, right? And I know this isn't obvious. Like you're counterintuitively, it doesn't seem like there's a threat here. So I think that's maybe one of the topics that's most interesting to me is what kind of cognitive heuristics or psychology would develop to impart that kind of information if it maps onto these sort of status game equilibria that people are in, right? Like, because you might expect that, right? You would expect that, like, if it's adaptive for you to figure out what local behavioral coordination equilibria are, then learning it in a very fast way from social communication, someone telling you who wants to give you adaptive information, sort of opens up the door, right, for that kind of a cognitive learning mechanism. And that does seem like, sitting on the lap and hearing grandpa tell you, in our country, we stand at the red light instead of crossing because you're going to get taken away if you don't, right? So I don't know, that maybe we can agree on that point, is that obviously there's an underlying physical reality here that is what's mapping behavior onto payoffs. And the basic task is to figure out what kind of evolutionary dynamics might lead to certain cognitive heuristics in that kind of circumstance.
Yeah. Well, we, as David mentioned, the audience in our heads about the people who are like, my God, how long is this going to go? We do need to wrap up, but I do want to ask, we have to ask the mandatory question of if we should have asked you anything. And then I also wanted to ask for you and you can do both. We still have plenty of time because we started a little later. Can you talk a little bit about the Leipzig Institute? So you're at a Max Planck. We had Annie Woods on so far, who was a research group leader in one of the independent research groups. You're in one of the permanent research groups in Leipzig. Can you talk a little bit either about sort of what the group more broadly does, or just also sort of what the structure is at that Max Planck?
Yeah, so I'm in the Department of Human Behavior, Ecology, and Culture. And our institute is the Max Planck for Evolutionary Anthropology, is the main focus. So in our institute itself, we have a number of different departments. There's one on cross-cultural psychology. There's genetics, archaeology, linguistics. So there's a number of different kind of affiliated teams that are working in the building. And our group specifically is focusing on topics related to behavioral ecology, for mostly for humans. The title has human in it, human behavior, ecology, and culture, but we also include non-human organisms like birds, and the main focus is it's a really compelling program that our director laid out, Richard McElreath, that basically all of these questions that we're talking about have a need for lots of data. Like we need to have more data, potentially sharper theory based on new kinds of data. And so our mandate is to try to develop both of those simultaneously. So we're building up new theoretical sort of stages for looking at particular kinds of data sets. And we're also looking for new kinds of data sets, or specifically in the context of collecting longitudinal field data. My particular side of things has been working with the Chimane project. I know you had Chris on earlier, so you might have talked about
Yeah, we're gonna have Mike
the
on
Chimane.
too. We're gonna have Mike
Oh,
Irvin
there we
soon too.
go.
So
Yeah.
yes.
So, yeah, I've been collaborating with Mike Gervin for God, like 13 years now, uh, and working in Bolivia. And I think that, the way forward, that's just my general sense, is that we want to have lots of data to specifically target these kinds of questions. Like what can we say about the information environment that people are in when they're making decisions in like a naturalistic setting? And more specifically to my interest too is what are the kind of mechanisms that are causing cultural change to happen? So like if I mean, it's one thing to talk about, oh, why are there patterns of cultural variation spatially? But we also see changes in those patterns too, right? As some get bigger and some shrink, new ideas emerge and spread, some die out. And so that's, I think, kind of the overall theme of the work that we do, is figuring out ways to combine sort of evolutionary theory with empirical data collection in sort of a high resolution field context, that helps us maybe make forward progress on sort of the standard debates or the standard questions, I think, in evolutionary anthropology or evolutionary science.
Yeah, it's a beautiful building. Leipzig is very important historically. Wilhelm Wundt was, live knocking around in Leipzig in the 18 1854. I don't remember anymore. 59, something like that. Yeah. And there's a climbing wall in the Institute too. It's a beautiful building.
That is true. I've never actually used it though, but
Okay.
some of our department members had.
Yeah.
In terms of questions, I was hoping you'd ask me about Go, but we never got a chance to talk about that.
Mm.
I don't know if that's something that either of you are familiar with. I mean, David, you're a game master yourself of sorts.
That
And
is true.
there's a piece of cultural transmission for you, right? I mean, we have a board game
Absolutely.
which has been around for like 3,000 years. People have commentaries on, games that are hundreds of years old. And then the way in which those strategies change over time. I mean, people are learning these strategies on the board. They're changing them. There's successes, there's failures. The most recent, of course, interesting thing has been the arrival of AlphaGo,
Hmm.
uh, and sort of the effect of now having these superhuman players that we can consult with all the time. I mean, that's kind of neat because we're talking about like cultural transmission from non-human agents, essentially, right? That you're getting feedback from not LLMs, they're called deep learning algorithms. But I mean, this is true for a lot of games. I think in general, we've got this sort of uh, revolutionary effect of having like sabermetrics for professional sports, doing very careful analyses of particular tactics in baseball and soccer, football. There's things like Stockfish and chess and AlphaGo and Go. And I mean, it's really having a huge impact on the actual strategic environment in the game. Like actually, quantifying the way that ideas move through these games. It's quite noticeable, and that's something I think that's maybe ripe for looking at as a cultural evolutionary topic. Because these are quite
Yeah.
complex. I mean, this is like, am I using this particular strategy or that strategy?
Hmm.
To some extent, you have to learn it, or it's very difficult to rediscover it on your
Right.
own. So I think in that circumstance, it's like, okay, yeah, cultural evolution, like what are the evolutionary dynamics of the idea? But then also, it's like, why has this game been around for so long? I mean, 3,000 years, it's ridiculous. Like, and looking at the way in which, I mean, it's just sort of a general topic about gaming. Like, what is it about games that makes them successful? I don't know. question for David, perhaps. Like,
Oh, I mean, yes, I mean, yeah, I would need, many books to answer that question. It's extremely complicated. I mean, we don't really even have a good theory of what gaming is and what it's for. I feel like that itself is an area ripe for investigation. I remember some philosopher described it as like a form of crystallized agency. Like in the same way as like a painting would be crystallized seeing. It's like the essence of what seeing is, and music is
Mm,
like the purest form of hearing. He makes the case
mm.
that gaming is like the purest form of agency, of like making decisions. And I think that's an insightful way of looking at it. But honestly, like our understanding of the evolutionary psychology of gaming and why we're attracted to it, what we get from it, what the benefits are, I think that's still very mysterious, and ripe for examination.
yeah,
The you know
I think I remember hearing from John Tooby when I was an undergrad that, I mean, the attractiveness of the game is that it allows a certain degree of virtuosity to be possible. That, it's like we have to
Mm,
be kind of bad at the game to be able to get skill differentials. And if it's something that everybody's just amazing at, I don't know, like
Yeah.
facial recognition or something, like
Yeah. I'm
it's
the
not
best
compelling as a
walker in
game.
this
Exactly, right? Look
city.
look at
Yeah.
me go,
Exactly.
Um, and so that's something about, like, we're attracted to things that we're bad at and then turn it into a game because then people can get good, as the kids say.
interesting.
Um,
Yeah, that's
I don't
interesting,
know.
Brett.
That
That's
was
actually that is actually a real important part of the psychology, David, for status games is like
Yeah.
having a folk theory of the variability, right? Exactly right. If everybody does it, it's like, man, I'm not going to get any status being the best breather. Everybody's breathing pretty well.
Yeah, totally. I love that way of thinking about it. And it's a particularly interesting topic, this idea of Go, because it's a case of cultural evolution where you wouldn't necessarily expect it to follow the typical kinds of diffusion that are shaped by conformity. Because in a strategic game like Go, you don't necessarily want to copy the same strategy that everyone else is performing, because then people are going to be able to anticipate you and outfox you. You might want to be unpredictable and have the element of surprise, in which case you want to do something like the opposite of imitation and conformity, and that leads to a whole different set of cultural dynamics. And so it's a really fascinating topic. And yeah,
Yeah, there's a great paper by Igor Lapo and Mark Feldman on chess that basically looks at exactly that. That you can think about this like a negative frequency dependence. Moves that are popular potentially would be things that you would want to avoid because your opponent is prepared for it, right?
Mhm.
I
This
think
is
that's
how I do
that's
okay in poker, is like I get bored with playing it explicitly, so I just play implicitly and I don't even know what I'm doing. And I actually will do quite well because I'm just completely unpredictable.
yeah.
Sometimes. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
yeah, actually, I have a paper on that, the conformity aspect in Go. I mean, the trade-off is that if you start a variation that's totally wild, you could also get yourself into trouble very quickly too, because it's hard to figure out what to do next.
No, totally.
Uh, and if you're, I mean, it's a computational problem. If, like,
Yeah.
people sort of know, okay, the next 10 moves, if we just follow like a normal opening sequence, it's kind of like it's a gentleman's agreement in some ways, that like the action's going to start later, but we're going
Right.
to, as a truce, we're going to continue going down this line that we both know very well. A really high level play, though, I mean, this is what I'm hearing from, like, YouTube videos and podcasts and stuff, that, like, there's a lot of like espionage for
Mm,
really high, high stakes matches where people want to know what their opponent is training on, like which lines are they prepared for, so that they can do the opposite and use something that they're
right.
not. And so it's like really high stakes to know, like, what people are, ready to respond on. I think that was the source of that controversy with Magnus Carlsen last year, that his opponent responded to him too quickly, according to him, and he's like, "Oh, you must have, like, cheated somehow
Mm.
and found out about what I was planning to do."
You read my computer files, and yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's interesting.
So yeah, I mean, I mean, absolutely, like, in a strategic context, the frequency dependence here is a key factor. But yeah, how that shapes long-term evolutionary dynamics, I think that's a really cool question. And I've been spending a lot of time looking at that recently. So,
Yeah. Awesome. Well, this flew by, so we'll have to have you on again.
oh, that'd be
Yeah, this
great.
is
I had
super
a great
fun.
time.
Yeah.
It's really
Yeah.
interesting talking to you both.
Well, Brett, we'll post some link to your website, which is great, and all the cool stuff from galaxies to bike tires, although not, but the Shimano Health Project, the wrist attitudes, and Game of Go, which is
Yeah.
super cool. So, yeah, thank you so much. Have a good evening. Thanks so much for being with us in the evening here, Shinabend, and yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks a lot, guys.
David, when you're all done after a long day, do you sometimes drink beer?
Sometimes I drink beer, but usually what I do is I write kind reviews about all the podcasts
Oh, wow.
that I enjoy. That's one of my favorite activities to do late at night is I write kind reviews about my favorite podcasts. Sometimes I just, post messages on social media saying how awesome those podcasts are. And
Yeah.
occasionally, if I've had, a few beers, I'll even go onto the Patreon pages of some of those podcasts
Okay.
and throw them a few
Yeah.
bucks.
Apropos of nothing.
Yeah, it's just something I
Yeah,
like to
just
do,
something,
but
just kind of like that kind of person. Yeah,
yeah, that's just the kind of
just
guy I
kind
am.
of, just feels like the right thing to do. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Well, we're not
Um,
going to interrogate that or question that at all. So yeah.
no,
Okay.
no, I think we'll just, just
We'll
put
leave it
that
at
out there.
that. Okay.
All right.
Bye.
See you next week.